I thank the witnesses for their testimony. The chair reminds each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses. I will now recognize myself for questions. Ms. Howard, threats to election security vary widely in the United States. There's the threat of a cyber attack on election infrastructure. There's the threat of influence operations that radicalize people with misinformation and disinformation and malinformation. And then there's the threat of violence and harassment and intimidation against election officials themselves. Of all these threats, which one, in your view, has the greatest likelihood of endangering election security in the 2020 congressional midterm elections? 2022, I apologize.
Thank you for the question. Right now, one of my biggest concerns has to do with threats against election officials, not just because of the threats against the election officials, but because of the cascading effects that result from these threats to election officials. So what we're seeing across the country are election officials who are deciding to leave the profession. So for example, 5 out of Arizona's 15 counties now have new election directors this cycle. 6 of Georgia's most populous counties have new election directors this cycle. This creates the potential for more mis and disinformation because the people taking the retiring election officials' place are not going to have the same level of experience, they're not going to know as much, and they're not going to be as prepared as those who had several years of experience who were running elections in their state and their county to combat, right, this ever-growing threat of mis, dis, and malinformation.
Ms. Howard, you noted that 1 in 6 election officials have been the target of threats. We heard from Secretary Oliver and Mr. Kelly that they themselves have been the targets of threats. And we know that former President Trump's narrative of a stolen election inspired the Stop the Steal movement, which ultimately led to the insurrection on January 6th. My question is for Mr. Kelly and Secretary Oliver. To what extent, based on your own experience, are the words and ideas of former President Donald Trump at fault for creating what seems to be an unprecedented hostile environment against election officials?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I will say this, that although these types of discourse were amplified in 2020, I've heard them before. If you go back to 2018 in Orange County, there was a number of similar threats and issues that arose when we had congressional districts flip from red to blue. We received very similar public statements from local elected officials. So it's not just at the national level, it can certainly happen at the local level. We see that. And I will say this, it's not just in battleground states or contested contests, it is across the country. So while I think it certainly had an effect, I've seen it before.
Secretary Oliver?
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly agree with my colleague, Mr. Kelly. But as you noted in my introduction, I've been an election official at the local and state level now for almost 16 years. So of course, in every single election, we see rumors, we see mis and disinformation. Typically, once we as election officials are able to clarify any questions about how the election's conducted and provide the public or accusers with information, those rumors tend to peter out. Unfortunately, we are still on a daily basis in my state and across the country living with the reverberating effects of the big lie from 2020. The recent activities that happened in my state where we almost failed to certify an entire county's worth of votes in a primary election are a direct result of that rhetoric. And as we all know, when it comes to leadership, what you say from the very highest echelons of government power in this country do have those reverberating effects. And so, yes, Mr. Chairman, they are impactful and they continue to be impactful on a daily basis in this work.
Ms. Howard, the DOJ task force, there's a DOJ task force aimed at confronting threats against election workers. It's received well over 1,000 reports of threats, but has only secured 1 conviction, which raises the question, why only 1 conviction? Is the issue one of law, that the law is insufficiently protective of election workers, or is it one of enforcement? What is your assessment of what's going on there?
So the DOJ task force has taken important steps, but clearly what they've done is not enough. We have a couple of recommendations specifically for the DOJ task force. We think that they need to expand the task force to include state and local law enforcement. As our Brennan Center survey showed, Almost 9 out of 10 election officials who had been threatened reported those threats not to federal officials, but to their local law enforcement. DOJ needs to bring them to the table to help combat this serious threat.
And just before I conclude, do you think federal law is sufficiently protective of election workers?
I think there are improvements to be made.